Hello and welcome to Chapter 14, Environmental Health and Toxicology. So essentially this video is going to be all about toxicology. So by the end you're going to want to have a pretty good grasp on a couple main toxins, the effects that they have, how they move through ecosystems, and eventually how to actually graph them and their effects. Alright, first let's take a look at environmental hazards. First, physical hazards. A physical hazard is basically anything that arises naturally and affects human health. So think of something such as UV radiation that comes from the sun and it hurts humans. It's a physical hazard. Next, let's look at chemical hazards. So a chemical hazard basically includes many synthetic chemicals. So think, for example, pesticides, pharmaceuticals, etc. A biological hazard results from ecological interactions among organisms. So think of like parasitism or infectious diseases. That's a biological hazard. Okay, so next we have cultural hazards. So think of a cultural hazard as basically a lifestyle choice or something based off of cultural influences. So take, for example, here, the devil itself, smoking cigarettes. Obviously very bad for you. That's a cultural hazard. Lastly, let's take a quick look at indoor hazards. So that's basically what it sounds like. These are a list of some pretty important toxins that exist indoors. So we're going to go through those quickly. Let's start with radon. So radon is a highly toxic radioactive gas. So keep that in your head. That's a very important one. Next, we have asbestos. And asbestos was used as insulation previously in buildings, so in like the early 1900s, because it actually does serve as good insulation. However, it is very toxic. And so it's a big thing now for people to get rid of all the asbestos in their homes or businesses. Next, we have lead. And lead leads to lead poisoning, which can really hurt people's brain, kidney function, etc. Really, really bad for you. And at the bottom here, we have things known as PBDEs, which are basically very, very flame retardant, but at the same time very, very toxic. And so there are many, many diseases associated with these toxins, and they're really, really bad to interact with. Okay, let's take a look now at toxicology. Basically, toxicology is the science that examines the effects of poisonous substances on humans and other organisms. So just as with anything, toxins are all around us, both natural and synthetic. And so they're not inherently bad at certain levels because from the moment we're in the womb and at a very young age we are exposed to them. But basically what makes them dangerous is that at certain levels or certain time periods they do become very, very dangerous. Let's take a look at something known as Silent Spring, which is something we talked about earlier. That's the book that Rachel Carson published. Basically, Silent Spring is the first fight against pesticide use in DDT specifically. So it basically called out DDT, which is what's going on here, as a pesticide, saying it's more harmful than beneficial. Okay, let's take a look at the title, Toxicants Come in Different Forms. So we're going to run through the main forms that they come in, starting with carcinogens. So a carcinogen is basically a substance that causes cancer. A mutagen is something that causes a DNA mutation. A teratogen harms the development of human embryos. A neurotoxin harms the nervous system. Allergens here overactivate the immune system, causing an unnecessary immune response. Endocrine disruptors interfere with hormone and hormone releases and the amount of hormones produced. So if you look back at the words themselves, a lot of them are relating to what they cause. So you think of carcinogen, sounds a lot like cancer, mutagen sounds like mutation. So there are ways to remember them, but you should remember the effect of all of these different types of toxins. Okay, let's move on to movement and accumulation of toxins and toxicants. So a lot of toxins are soluble in water, and others transport through air. So those are like two major means of them traveling through ecosystems and hurting animals and humans. Now let's talk about two main terms known as bioaccumulation and biomagnification. Basically, bioaccumulation is if a toxicant accumulates in an animal. So think of a fish, for example, being exposed to some type of radiation or some type of toxin. That's going to stay in that fish and it's going to accumulate in that one fish. From there, biomagnification occurs. So biomagnification is basically occurs as animals that have experienced bioaccumulation are consumed by predators. Thus, it spreads through the trophic levels. So say a toxin starts in water. From there, it moves on to producers like plants. Then from there, it moves on to zooplankton, then to small fish, then large fish, and then eventually fish-eating birds. So the problem is, if you look at, for example, DDT in this chart, DDT is going to move through the whole ecosystem, really destroying all the different levels of animals and consumers. Also, effects are studied through animal testing and case studies, mostly in toxins, because that's how you can really see how things have an effect. Alright, so now let's take a look at a dose-response analysis. So that's basically how you graph the results of certain exposure to toxins. So we have both an LD50 and an ED50, and on the x-axis right here we have the dose amount, and on the y-axis we have the response. Let's start with LD50. So LD50 stands for lethal dose. So basically what that means is this LD50 point here is when 50% of individuals are killed by a certain exposure, a certain dosage. That's how you get that number. Comparatively, an ED50 is the effective dose. So that's basically if you want to graph a non-lethal result. So in this case, they're doing sleep. So at a certain exposure, 50% of the individuals being tested are asleep at that point. Okay, let's take a look now at risk and the EPA/the European Union. So when looking at toxins and toxicants, there are certain risks involved. And so you need to do something known as risk assessment, which is pretty much what it sounds like. You need to assess the risk. And that brings you to risk management. You have to figure out how to manage that certain risk and test it and move on from there. So those are pretty straightforward, but the book does discuss them, so understand them. This takes us into the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was passed by the EPA. Basically, if you look at page 395, this is where it explains it. So basically what this does is it puts the EPA in charge of monitoring thousands of industrial chemicals manufactured in or imported into the United States, ranging from things like PCBs to asbestos. Okay, and so REACH is pretty much the further progressed European Union equivalent. So if you look at page 396, that's where it discusses it. Basically, what REACH is responsible for is it shifts the burden of proof for testing chemical safety from national governments to industry and requires that chemical substances produced or imported in amounts of over 1 metric ton per year be registered with a new European Chemicals Agency. So basically what REACH does is put further responsibility on industry for making sure things aren't toxic. Okay, this brings us to our conclusion. So toxicants are all around us. This is unavoidable. However, without further research and knowledge, they will continue to pose a large risk. So what we can do to manage this is continue to research and figure out how to keep toxins from affecting people, animals, and ecosystems. Okay, in Chapter 15, we're going to look at freshwater systems and resources. See you next time.